Welcome to the video lecture for chapter 13, the last chapter of the semester for you guys. Um, this chapter just kind of wraps up all the amendments that we didn't talk at for this semester. The four remaining amendments to the Bill of Rights are the Third Amendment, the Seventh Amendment, the Ninth Amendment, and the 10th Amendment, and then we also work through some of the other amendments to the Constitution. So the Third Amendment prohibits soldiers being housed in private homes during peacetime without the owner's consent and during wartime without legal process. The Supreme Court has never had a case that's looked at this amendment, but it kind of just holds this principle that the government should leave us alone if they don't have compelling cause, like a time of war. Now, the Seventh Amendment gives the federal right to a jury trial for all cases that come out of common law if the value is more than $20. So that $20 is definitely pretty dated. But this is essentially giving the right to a jury trial to a civil case. Here we can think of common law as being civil law. So in federal courts, you have the right to a jury trial for a civil case as well as your criminal case. The Ninth Amendment established the rights of the United States citizens extend beyond those that are directly listed in the Constitution. This does not have any significant rights attached to it. It's largely historical. Some of the rights that might or have been discussed of the Ninth Amendment might provide some umbrella protection to are the right to privacy, the right to interstate travel, the right to international travel, the right to vote, and freedom of association. One of the first times the Ninth Amendment was actually discussed by the Supreme Court was in 1965 in Griswold v. Connecticut. In this case, Connecticut said that married couples could not obtain contraceptives. So if you were married, you could not obtain birth control, which was the primary issue here. This married couple did not want to have kids, or at least not want to have kids right then. They both were in agreement that they wanted to use birth control, and there was a state law that prohibited that. And the Supreme Court struck down that state law under the Ninth Amendment, saying that there are rights that are not expressly enumerated, and there are certain zones of privacy into which the government cannot intrude. But privacy is not unique to just the Ninth Amendment. It houses little pieces of it in the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, and so in the First Amendment. So not exhaustive here, but this is an early time where we saw the Ninth Amendment being used to protect a right to marital privacy. The 10th Amendment embodies the principle of federalism. So the idea of the states sharing power between the federal government and the states. We actually saw an example of federalism playing out in the news this week, if you've been keeping up with the slight debate over who gets to call the shots about reopening the country up after the close of COVID-19. We saw President Trump assert the federal government's authority. We saw states, governors assert their authority, and it has come down to be a state decision because of opening up an individual state's economy is part of a police power. So the state's governor has a lot of say over the health and safety of their own citizens. So all these reserve powers, these are commonly looked at health and safety for your specific state, policing, education, things like that within your state. The federal government, meanwhile, maintains all delegated powers, enumerated and implied by legal authority. So these are things that are actually in the Constitution that the federal government has the power to do, and then they have the implied authority to carry out their duties. So that's just kind of embodying federalism. Sometimes these things come to issue. In the 90s, under the Brady Act, Congress tried to require state and local law enforcement to run background checks on prospective gun buyers, and that principle did violate the 10th Amendment. It violated sovereignty. The federal government cannot order states to carry out certain police powers. Now, some other amendments to the Constitution. The 11th Amendment deals with judicial power and is kind of viewed as an administrative directive. It was introduced the day after the Supreme Court ruled that citizens of one state had the right to sue citizens of another state. We have the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. This directly overturned a prior Supreme Court case called Dred Scott. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, it's the law of the land. We saw, thinking back about Dickerson v. United States, where Congress tried to overturn the Miranda warnings. Congress can't do that. So the Supreme Court has to overturn their own cases, and if they don't, the remedy is that we need to amend the Constitution to change the meaning of the Constitution. So this is really rare and dramatic, but it is an illustration of checks and balances. The Supreme Court can't go too far, and if they do, we can change the Constitution, but rare. So Dred Scott is a case from 1857. Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri. He lived in a free state for years, and he tried to sue for his own freedom to verify that he was a free slave. And the Supreme Court ruled that he was a slave, and that that only Congress could confer national citizenship, and essentially that he was less than a man and he could not be a citizen of the United States. So yeah, the justice who wrote it, Taney, reached a conclusion that no person descended from an American slave had ever been a citizen for Article 3 purposes. So that's why we see the 13th Amendment coming in to overturn that, because the Supreme Court said that slaves cannot be citizens of the United States, period. And so when we abolish slavery, we cannot leave an entire group of people in limbo with no status. So Congress had to, and the Supreme Court refused to overturn Dred Scott, so Congress had to abolish slavery and give them citizenship. The next amendment, the 14th Amendment, we've talked about just a couple weeks ago, protects due process of law, equal protection of law, has been selectively incorporated to the states. Now, at this point, we've talked about most of the amendments that deal directly with specific rights and liberties, but there are other types of amendments that are a little more administrative, about elections, how long a president can serve in office. So the 12th Amendment established the electoral system. So the Electoral College that we use to elect a president. The 14th Amendment establishes how representatives are apportioned and what their qualifications must be. So the first part of the 14th Amendment has that due process, that equal protection clause, but there are actually more parts to the amendment that don't contain individual civil rights and liberties. And one of those sections tells us how our House of Representatives is going to be apportioned. The 17th Amendment describes how the United States Senate is composed, what qualifications you need to have, and how vacancies are filled. For these qualifications, oftentimes it just has a minimum age. So like you have to be at least 40 to be president or something like that. I didn't double check those ages, by the way, so don't take that to the bank. The 15th Amendment states, oh wait, I skipped some. So the 22nd Amendment restricts the presidency to 2 terms. This was happened after Franklin Delano Roosevelt served 4 terms. After this, we see a restriction. The 23rd Amendment gives representation to the District of Columbia in the federal government. The 25th Amendment establishes the procedures for filling vacancies and the actions that should be taken if the president, for some reason, becomes unable to discharge their duties. So like if they were to get really sick and they could not be president, we would turn to the 25th Amendment to follow the process. The 27th Amendment prevents Congress from setting its own salary because it's in a conflict of interest. It is okay for Congress to give itself cost of living raises because that is not the same thing as an actual raise, but they cannot set their own salary. Other amendments focus more on voting, and so there's there's a section of this chapter that deals with voting. That's a pretty important section. The 15th Amendment requires that the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 19th Amendment requires that women cannot be denied the right to vote. This here notes that women get the right to vote 50 years after black males, which is absolutely true. So women had to fight for 50 additional years to get the right to vote. But women were not subject to some of the discrimination and treatment black males continued to face even after they were given the right to vote. So it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison here. Let's see, the 24th Amendment requires that from 1964 that you cannot be denied the right to vote because you didn't pay a poll tax or any other tax. So this is one of those mechanisms that was used to keep black men from exercising their right to vote. We had literacy tests and poll tests and all these other things. And so this is 1964. This is at 1920, women get the right to vote. 1964, we finally end this restriction on primarily persons of color that kept them from voting. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. Let's see. The 16th Amendment established the federal income tax. The 18th Amendment prohibited the sale of alcohol. And the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. So there have been attempts at other amendments that have been proposed. Congress has considered amendments prohibiting burning of the flag, establishing victims' rights, requiring the federal budget to be balanced. In 2003, a Senate subcommittee approved a proposal to amend the Constitution to guarantee rights to victims, but it hasn't really gone far. It's interesting to look at, though, if you're interested in that. Overall, Congress is reluctant to make significant changes. Also, this leaves out the Equal Rights Amendment, which has been in the news somewhat, and so that's a look at that men and women need to be guaranteed equal pay would be one thing it would do, and equal opportunity for positions. So, and that amendment actually has a decent chance of eventually being ratified. We don't know, and there's a Hulu series about kind of the Equal Rights Amendment that just came out. I think it's called Miss America. So if you're looking for something to do, that might be interesting and kind of tie back into class. All right, the process of amending the Constitution. This is super duper important. So this is laid out for us in Article 5. There are two different ways to ratify the Constitution. The first way is that the House and Senate propose an amendment. This would be done through a joint resolution, and 2/3 of congresspersons approve the amendment. The second way is that 2/3 of state legislatures, which for right now would be 34 states, call for a constitutional amendment, a convention to draft a constitutional amendment. So we have 27 amendments to the Constitution, and every single one of them came about because Congress put forth the joint resolution. Now, after that comes forward, then we need to have states draft it or ratify it. We need 3/4 of states to ratify an amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. So under the current 50 states, that means 38 states need to ratify an amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. There doesn't need to be a time limit. Sometimes Congress will say this needs to be approved within so many years, but that is not in the Constitution itself, and so there's no reason to think that that is binding. And in fact, the 27th Amendment was first proposed in 1789, and it was not ratified until 1992. So, it was hanging out there for a long time, which is pretty interesting if you think about it. All right, that is the end of this video lecture. Please reach out if you have any questions or concerns. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy.